exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. That's what we do at Kung Fu Podcast. I'm your host, Sifu T.W. Smith. Thank you so much for joining me today in episode number 117. If this is your first time here to the program, welcome. I hope that you will find that the information that I provide is educational as well as entertaining. And, most of all, I just appreciate that you stop by and give me an opportunity to be part of your day and as well as part of your martial arts journey. This is a perfect time to remind everyone that, this program started off as primarily a focus in Chinese martial arts because that's where I come from. But since then, we've expanded out into many different areas, and some of that also includes why we practice. And this episode is going to probably deal with that more than anything else. And that is, some folks practice for the practical martial arts. They want to be able to protect themselves. They want to be able to keep people that they care about safe. Then we have those folks who practice for a philosophical way of life. They practice for the physical education components or the cultural components or just for good health, or for many, they practice for a lifestyle and having something to have a structure inside of their lives, which is a big deal for me as well. In this episode, we're going to look at an email that a listener had sent in, and it kind of reminded me, I've read it, and I've probably had this email now for about a month or two, and I've read through it several times, and it reminds me sometimes of when I'm talking with my son. He's about 14 now, and occasionally, he'll sit down, he'll have homework, and he'll read an article, and he's supposed to then write a little paragraph or two about what he's read. And it should include things about what were the results, what did he believe that the author was trying to share, and to summarize those things in a way that is both accurate to the information that was shared, but then also trying to relate the message in the story. And there are times where he and I will sit down and he'll start to read me what it is that he has there for his summary. And when he's done, I'll look at him and say, "Son, did we read the same story?" Because some of the information you have shared here with me, I didn't hear in that story. Or at least I didn't hear it in the way that you just said it. And so we end up going back through things and trying to revisit, where did we get off track here? How did we miss that? That kind of thing. And as he and I are working, and as I would share with you, whenever we're making adjustments in ourselves or with people we care about, it's always important to remind them, and it's not a criticism of the person. We all look at things a little differently. Sometimes we look at something once or twice and we still don't have it. I tell my students a lot of times when I'm watching an NCIS episode, I'll watch it 3 times. And the reason is because I've tried to learn how to tell stories better. And so the first time I watch an episode, it's strictly for the entertainment. What was good, how much fun was the story to listen to and observe through the actors and the characters. The second time I watch it from the standpoint of why was it funny? Or why was it interesting? What compelled me with that? What really piqued my interest? And then the third time I watch it, I try to watch it on how did they do it? Was it in the mannerism? Was something happening 2 minutes ago that set up the part that really piqued my interest a little bit later? It's then a third level for me, and I end up doing that a lot because I'm not very good at doing things all in one match. I kind of have to shift my mind like a filter, watch something, then go back through it, watch it again. That can happen with a lot of us, and in particularly with the martial arts. And then when we have folks who are really good in studying the practical martial arts like Jamie Clubb or Ian Abernathy, and then we have other folks who are some of the finest researchers that you're going to find in the world like Dr. Ben Junkins or Paul Bowman, who did the whole thing on the mythologies of martial arts, and looking how people can take martial arts and turn and look at them from a totally different perspective or purposely present them in a way that makes them convey a whole different story. It also reminds me of Dr. Tan's episodes where, a lot of folks look at martial arts as a way of finding themselves or finding part of their culture as they did in the Aikido. And you're going to really see that in the upcoming series on Tai Chi Chuan, The Search for the Little Old Chinese Man, which is slated to start with episode 1 next week. So what I'm going to do now is share with you the email, and I'm not going to give any names or anything out. I'm just going to share with you the email I got, and then I'm going to kind of give you some of my thoughts about it, okay? They write, I have a YouTube channel, and it is mostly about fitness and martial arts. I'm looking for someone to work with. I like to invent new techniques and test them in a mock, no-contact way, meaning mock, dummy, or choreographed, and grotesque choreographed violence akin to horror. My philosophy is less is more. Not knowing is knowing, and focusing on natural ability. I like street-based techniques and try to make it look as real as possible. The email went a little bit further, but that's far enough for what I wanted to discuss here. The last sentence is the first sentence I would like to review just for a moment, where he says, I like street-based techniques and try to make it look as real as possible. Well, we can get from the email that he's, partly in the entertainment, the kung fu for show or the martial arts for show, which is part of what almost every martial arts has in it at some point in time. And in some cases, many martial artists would make their living doing almost like circus-like events as well as movies or entertainment and things like that. So there's nothing wrong with that. But when he says street-based techniques, as martial artists go, I don't really have any differentiation between so-called street-based techniques or what I need to do. Basically we have objectives and then strategies and techniques that help you meet those objectives. It's not too much more complicated than that. I think it was Sun Tzu who said, great techniques and a poor strategy is the short road to defeat, and great strategy with poor techniques is the long road to victory. So basically all it's saying is that you can have all the techniques in the world, but in real martial arts, not the martial arts for show, which you can choreograph any way you like. But when it comes to techniques, you have techniques that will be more sound and more attuned to helping you achieve your objectives and your goals if you were out in a community, an alleyway, or some place like that, as compared to if the same techniques were being exercised inside of a ring on a mat. But I reread this email many times, and I thought it was a great way to just kind of digesting how many of us can look at martial arts and come at it from a different perspective. But if we're not careful, sometimes we might lose what I think of as the core of martial arts. And in the first part of his email, he says things about, I like to invent new techniques. And that part right there is whenever I hear that, my little BS antennas start to go up. Now, and it's only because, here we are at a place in our lives in most people's countries, not everybody, because I know some of you are in places that you literally do have to be aware of your livelihood on a regular basis. But the majority of us live in a place that we're fairly safe and sound. So when it comes to having developed new techniques, we got people that go all the way back to Genghis Khan, Caesar, and many other entities and beings that dedicated their lives to the martial arts and put their livelihoods on the line with their martial arts. And the human body is not like the Lego man, where we can go in one day and rebuild him and say, okay, his knee can have the capacity to do that today that he couldn't have done 500 years ago. The human body hasn't changed over time. Or let me rephrase that. It has changed over time, but in the opposite direction, because many of the capacities that I had as a younger man are a little diminished now through just good old wear and tear. So I have to use my mind and cleverness a lot more than I did when I was younger, where I could just use a lot more speed and strength. So to the point of developing new techniques, you don't see that. That's extremely rare that someone's come up a new way to do something to the human body that has not been discovered over the past 4,000 years. However, there are new ways of applying techniques to reach an objective that perhaps wasn't the case in how it was being exercised in, say, 6 months or 2 years ago. So, for example, the New York Police Department, after an accidental death in 2015, as they were trying to bring a suspect into custody, Several of the officers were trying to get the suspect down, and later, due to the incident, he died. Well, the New York Police Department began to review their techniques to reach their objective, which is to get the man down. And that's usually the case. The officers are usually trying to keep themselves and the public safe at the same time, as well as get the suspect face down and cuffed. So the New York Police Department reviewed the application of a choke technique, and they started working on what is called an armbar hammerlock technique, which you can see in most martial arts, to get the suspect down, and they practice it now in teams. The New York TV station Pix 11 reported in March 2015 that after the incident, the New York Police Department was changing their techniques, but there was already some concerns about these new techniques. The reporter goes to a martial arts facility in New York where they are practicing the technique, trying to test its effectiveness. As they walk through the application of the armbar hammerlock, it is practiced in 2 to 3 man teams, and the application of the technique worked out pretty good in their interview with a mostly compliant receiver. The real problem that they brought out, though, through the interview of this is that the report said that the officers only had 3 days to learn to execute and, air quote, master the lock application. The instructor in the interview says that 3 days is not enough, but it's better than nothing. In their written report, they said it could take up to 2 weeks to master the technique, and then it has to be practiced pretty consistently after that. So in that case, what I want to do is kind of present, okay, there was not a new technique. It's the armbar hammerlock, which many of you would recognize, but then taking it from here and trying to apply it slightly differently in order to still meet the same objective. Now that, to me, is good because you're really trying to look at different ways to meet the same objectives with the minimal amount of violence, if it's possible. But in the email, he said that he wanted to test them in a mock, no-contact way. And to be honest with you, I didn't really quite know what that meant. I know that when I was in college football, we would go mock drills or have a mock team, and you go through, different exercises. But basically, when I went to look up what mock actually means, it just says not authentic or real, but without the intention to deceive. So in the email, I got a little bit lost about what was he trying to tell me, that he was going to develop a new technique, but he was going to test it in a mock way without any contact. And then I began to just assume that all of it was just basically for the camera angle, which, when I worked with Kevin Roberg, who produced programs like Geo Pirates, and several students and myself worked with him on Kung Fu Puppet, and I just went to his production called Tony and Tina, which was absolutely hilarious. But even then, when he was doing the camera work and we were doing the show, he wanted us to push the boundaries, but to stay within the ideas of what would be considered realistic as far as martial arts goes as possible. And this would be something that it looked good, but it would still be practical, or at least it would seem practical if you were going to do this. So as I read through the email, I was just assuming that we were thinking about practicing something strictly as if it was Jason Bourne or the Transporter. So that it was just choreographed. We were going to walk through it. It doesn't really matter if it's effective or not. We're just going to make sure that it looks good for the camera. And then when it came down to the understanding, this one is a big one. My son and I actually talk about this as well. And some students and I spoke about this probably just about a month or two ago. And it says where my philosophy is less is more. Not knowing is knowing, and focusing on natural ability. And I absolutely agree with the concept that less is more. And I would apply it directly to philosophy. A little is great, but too much, now we have philosophy where strategy and skills belong. And where it came down to not knowing is knowing, and I would say this is semi-true, because if you go through the entire process, it is not exactly true. But most people don't want to do that. They just want to skip over, and so that they're just doing one thing and they feel like it's the only thing to do. When it comes to knowledge or knowing is not knowing and things like that, there's a cycle to that. But the first thing, there's a trap to it as well. There was a lot of sayings when I was growing up. Actually, there was a lot of commercials that would say, knowledge is power. And then later in the martial arts, you were taught very specifically that that's not true. Knowledge is not power. Knowledge is potential power. Power, by definition, means that something is in action. Knowledge doesn't actually imply that there's any action at all. There are plenty of people who know exactly what they're supposed to be doing and knowing exactly when they're supposed to be doing it, but they don't. They actually don't take the action, so their power is worthless. It's only potential. If there is no action, there is no power. So power is actually a representation of your body. I mean, your flesh, bones, and fascia actually doing something. Then we have power. And when it comes to practicing martial arts, there's an old Chinese martial arts saying that says that training of the mind precedes training of the body. And with regular practice, training of the body will become superior to training of the mind. And basically what it means is that for you to learn something, I basically have to show you. Get you to say, okay, we're going to move this way, we're going to step this way, and now let's work with it and then add time in and get you to do these martial arts techniques or katas in patterns and do them in the air, maybe one individual technique over and over again, but get your mind to understand what I need it to know. And as you practice it, the mind through the motor cortexes, the neurology, the plasticity of the mind, and all that kind of good stuff, the body actually starts to gather a knowledge. But you do it in the air, and then you do it with a compliant partner, and then a little bit later to actually ingrain it a little deeper, maybe you do it with a heavy bag or a person wearing a pad. Now that knowledge of the mind gets deeper and deeper into the body, what we would call at that point muscle deep. And so what that means to the statement where you may not knowing is knowing, the only way that you actually get to not knowing something is to know it. In order to know something, you have to know it so well that you no longer have to intellectually think about it. Another metaphorical example of it is that you cannot let anything go until you've actually grasped it. So in order to let go of the knowledge, first you have to have it. And as I said when I started this podcast, it is not my intent to pound on this person that wrote in. It is much like when I was talking with my son going, is what you meant by that? Because I didn't quite see it, or that's not how I understood it. So I wanted to use this email as an opportunity to reflect. One is that you're hearing me openly reflect as I have read over it over and over again. And then, I'd love to hear from you. I mean, did I misinterpret it somehow? Did you hear something different? I absolutely love the fact that someone is out there listening to the program and they are exploring, creating, and finding a passion in their martial arts. But remember that martial arts rose out of conflict. It rose out of oppression, and that a principle was born somewhere in an individual or a group of people that said, this is going to stop, or this is going to change, or I'm going to die in the process of trying to make it happen. And if later one builds a philosophy out of that, or they learn how to tell stories or entertain themselves from that, or develop a way to develop physical education or health or research out of it, that is fantastic. But you can't lose the sight at the core. Why was your karate, your kung fu, your martial arts, why was it born? And what are you going to do with it as we go along? And we're going to look at how many of us develop through the martial arts as we review in next week's episode, Tai Chi, the search for the little old Chinese man. Thank you so much for joining me today in episode number 117. Exploring the culture, the adventure, and the impact of martial arts. Thank you so much for joining me today in episode number 117, where we took an email and we looked at how many of us could look through any of our martial arts. It's not a point to any particular philosophy or thoughts about it, but to always remind ourselves that we can get really far out there as far as how we might use our martial arts. But we always might want to keep one foot on that sidewalk of a practical understanding, so we don't get too far adrift, and we can always bring ourselves back. And we can all sit down at the same table, discuss our martial arts respectfully, and in a way that perhaps we can share thoughts and feelings, strategies, and objectives with one another, as well as our philosophies about life and how we're going to move forward. Please go out, have a fantastic practice today, do your best, and I look forward to talking with you next week.